So this is going to be a demonstration on how to just adjust your torsion bars on your front suspension in a Nissan Xterra. I've mentioned in other videos on suspension lifts that adjusting your torsion bars, and that's whether you have the stock upper control arms or the lift upper control arms, but that is the heart of doing the lift on the front end. Now I wanted to point out one quick thing is that when you're measuring your nose down rake, as in your ride height at the front versus the rear, and overall lift heights, you don't want to judge based on the top of your wheel arches, because the wheel arches are really just a cosmetic or an aesthetic thing that's cut into the body panel. So it doesn't really tell you anything if your wheel gaps between your tire and the wheel arch is the same or the ground to the wheel arch. What you want to look at is what would be perfectly parallel for a level stance, and that's going to be the floor of your vehicle. So you want to look at this seam right along the top. A couple things is that you want to make sure that you measure on each corner. So I've got rock sliders here, so I can measure my ride height to the rock slider, but that is based on the assumption that the rock slider is perfectly parallel the way it's bolted to the frame and that it's not any different. I choose to measure at the pinch seam right beneath the doors here. So I measure at the front, and I'm right around 24 3/4 of an inch. And I'm looking at it level, and I'm lining it up with the bottom of the door, not the start of the crease on the lower rocker panel here. I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing over here, and I'm right at 25 inches. So I got about a 1/4 inch rake front to back. My front end's about a 1/4 inch lower relative to the rear. Now I already checked this both left and right, and I've confirmed that I have the same rake on both sides. Now a couple things before you even get started. You got to understand that a vehicle is really just a large mass that's sitting on 4 different springs. Springs are going to deflect a certain amount based on the amount of weight on it. So the important thing here is the overall weight distribution of your vehicle. If you're really loaded down, take some of your gear out so it's just the vehicle by itself. Also, check your tire pressure on all 4 corners. If you have one tire that's lower, that's going to throw off your measurements. You want to make sure that you're measuring on a relatively level, flat surface like a garage floor. That's a pretty good start. And another thing that flies under the radar is even just uneven tire wear. The first time that I did this on my Nissan Xterra was when I first bought it, and it had 4 mismatched tires of differing amounts of tire tread. And what ends up happening is that if one tire is sitting up higher or has thicker tread left, that's going to rotate your weight distribution of the overall truck. So if your brand new tire is on the rear left, that's going to put the rear left corner higher. That's going to cause your truck to lean to the right and lean to the forward some. So you want to make sure that all your tires are relatively the same and at the same air pressure, and you're on a level surface. So my goal here, which I have the suspension lift and everything, but I want to just raise it up, and I'm going to try and shoot for that perfect level stance. One last thing to note is that as you adjust one, you're raising up that one side, and that can also throw off your distribution on the other side. So it's common to lift one side and then you're good where you are, but then you go to lift the other side and then it distributes some more weight back to the other side, and that can cause it to sag more. So it does take a bit of guess and check to try and get to the right stance that you want. Now the question is, how much lift can you get? And that is the important thing. I talk a lot about bump stop gaps. If you're unfamiliar with the bump stop gap, this is the gap that I'm talking about. This is your upper control arm that goes to the top of your steering spindle inside the rear of your rim here. And there's a bump stop. This is a low profile bump stop. The stock bump stop is a little bit taller, but you want at least a 1/2 inch gap between the upper control arm and where the stock bump stop would be. The important thing is not so much the physical gap between the two parts, but it's just a convenient way to measure the angle of your upper control arm. I mentioned in my other videos about suspension lifts and getting alignments on lifted vehicles and heavy-duty steering systems, but as you lift more, this angle of your tie rod increases. That stresses out your center link, and that can cause other problems. So you don't want to overlift, because that can cause your alignment to be off, and that can cause issues with your steering system. I've already measured this. I have a full inch gap to a low profile bump stop, which is about a 3/4 inch gap to the stock bump stop. So I'm just going to bring the front end about a 1/4 inch up and make sure that I still got about a 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch gap right here. Now I have an older video about re-indexing your torsion bars. So this is not re-indexing because you're not removing it and changing the clocked position. But you can watch that to get a better understanding of what a torsion bar is. But basically, if you look right behind your front tire, you can see a splined bar into your lower control arm. That's where your suspension flexes and pivots. And there's a bar, and you can follow it all the way back. So just for some context here, about halfway through the driver's side or the passenger side front doors, you go under, and this is what you're looking for. There's a cross member, there's a bolt head here, and if you look up above that bolt head, you can see a long bolt and a couple nuts. One is just a jam nut, and you need to loosen that, spray it with some PB Blaster to make it all loose. And basically, you're just going to put a wrench on this bolt head, and if you're on your back looking up at it, it's lefty-loosey, righty-tighty. So you're just going to tighten the bolt so the bolt head will go up, and when the bolt head goes up, that twists the bar this way, which is going to angle your lower control arm further down, which in turn makes it sit higher up. So the bolt head is 19 millimeter, and I believe it was a 19 to loosen the jam nut. And I just have a 19 millimeter deep well socket and a breaker bar. Again, you got to wrench on it pretty hard to get at it. But you can see the bolt head starting to turn, and you can see the bolt and the nut turning at the top. Aside from the actual bump stop gap that I showed you earlier, the only other limiting factor is going to be this adjuster lever. You can see that adjuster lever is sitting up inside a recessed area of a cross member, and if you tighten it too much, it's just going to bottom out on the back side. If you do bottom out this adjuster lever on the back side, that just means you cannot lift anymore. And if you still have room at your front bump stop gap, then you're going to have to re-index, where you take your entire torsion bar out, and then you're going to have to rotate it a spline or two to be able to give yourself some more room to adjust to your bump stop gap. So I do recommend that you kind of count how many times you're cranking the bolt on one side, and then kind of do the same amount on the other side. So this is about 5 or so partial turns of the wrench. And I'm just going to go over to the other side and do the same thing. So I'm getting close to maxing out the adjuster lever here. So this side might be my limiting factor. I'm not interested in re-indexing. That's a bigger pain in the ass. I'm just making a fine-tuned adjustment, but this same process works whether you're doing 3 inches of lift or a 1/4 inch. So after you've made a little bit of adjustment and you're curious to see where you are, I recommend just kind of jouncing your vehicle a little bit. So just rock on it, and that allows your tires to slip a little bit and your suspension to settle out. Because as you lift, you're pointing that control arm down, and what that means is that your tire is going to be pushed into the ground, and as it comes in, it's actually going to be sliding and narrowing in your track width just a little bit. We're talking on like fractions of an inch here. And so that friction with the ground can cause it to kind of bind it up and not give you a good reading. So just kind of shake the vehicle or go for a quick drive around the block and then recheck. So I'm right at 24 7/8 on the front, and right around 25, maybe just a 1/16 or so lower than 25 on the rear. So it's not uncommon as you lift the front, it's going to rock the weight of your vehicle more on the rear tires, which could cause it to sag down some. There is no method for like adjusting or fine tuning the ride height in the rear. So you're just adjusting the front left and front right to try and get an even rake left to right and get a good front to back rake based on the stance that you want. But at the end, when you get the stance that you want, don't forget to recheck your bump stop gap. And I got about a 1/2 inch to 3/4, and I should be good since I have the heavy duty reinforced steering system. The last thing to do is for that upper jam nut, go ahead and put a wrench on it and tighten it down. That is just a jam nut to hold the bolt steady. so it doesn't end up sagging or slipping or loosening up over time. Now after you drive it for a few days, it's always good for them to go back with your tape measure and just recheck the corners, make sure it didn't settle or sag in any different kind of way. But for the most part, I've never had to touch it after I make the final adjustments here. So after a few iterations of that, I was able to get right around 25 inches on all four corners. I now have a perfectly level rake, front to back and left to right. Now this is the same adjustment procedure for any type of first-gen Nissan Xterra where you're keeping the independent front suspension. So short of a solid axle swap where you're cutting everything off, this is how you get lift, whether you're doing the poor man's lift, PML, whether you're doing a stock torsion bar adjustment, or whether you're getting lift upper control arms and trying to get maximum lift in that front end. So comment below if you have any other questions or any other suggestions for future videos, and I appreciate you watching.